So thanks to joining for this session of Rail Magazine's monthly talk series. I stumbled across this idea when engaging with someone on Twitter, and if you don't know me, I'm Rich Sampson. I'm actually with the Southwest Transit Association, but most of you know me behind a black R that stands for Rail Magazine, which once upon a time was an actual printed publication that I was on the staff for about a decade, and we gradually transitioned it to a digital publication, and then pretty much on Twitter, although I have some resources that are on the web and other places that I need to do a little better job coordinating kind of on my off time. But during my day job, I'm the executive director of the Southwest Transit Association, covering 8 states in the Southwest. And I want to be clear from the outset that I'm doing this on my own time off work today, and none of the statements that I make or anyone else makes can be attributed to SWATA, my employer, or the NFTA who runs the Metro Rail. I just want to be clear that this is commentary and information, not so much any direct information from the NFTA or any other party. So I got into this topic by responding to somebody who said, what's some 30 topics you can talk about without preparation for about 30 minutes. And number one on my list was Buffalo Metro Rail. And I rode the system on opening day, 1984, rode down to check it all out. And ever since then, I was hooked on transit, especially rail transit, and been a long time rider and user of the system. Even after I went down to DC in the early 2000s to go to college, I still went back up to visit my family, and been following along ever since. So my personal interest is pretty much a lifetime story in this system. So I'm not going to wait too much longer to jump into the slides here, so you can kind of get a sense of where we're going and some interesting visuals to accompany my rambling here today. So feel free to share questions in the chat box. I'm the only person running the session, so I'll wait till I get done running the slides to answer those. So that's kind of how we're going to handle this. And thanks for joining. I'm going to just quickly here in the chat box pop in a couple links to the NFTA, which runs the Metro Rail system and the bus system, along with the airports in Buffalo and Niagara Falls and the Port Authority. So it's actually a multifaceted, multimodal transportation authority in the true sense of the word. And the other link there is Citizens for Regional Transit, which is a advocacy group in the Buffalo Niagara region, primarily advocating for transit expansion, but especially Metro Rail. So thanks for joining us. I do plan to do a couple more of these if this all goes well and get some good reaction to it, most likely on the difference between commuter rail and regional rail. Some of you have heard me go on for that for hours and can do hours, but we'll try to do that next, and perhaps one on the Lackawanna cutoff after that, which spurs much debate and interest among certain folks in northeastern Pennsylvania and the New York metro region. So starting off, this is a picture I took here in Buffalo when I was back home over the summer. And this is just a train coming out of the Lafayette Square station heading to Fountain Plaza, and kind of see a mix of the development, historic and redevelopment in downtown Buffalo, and just kind of an initial sense of what the rail lines look like. And you see the Seneca One Tower, which has been various banks most of its history, kind of straddling over Main Street south. So we're looking south. The train is heading north here towards University Station and South Campus. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So just some precursor background here is, why did Buffalo end up with a subway system? And it all kind of stems from the period basically after the 1950s, when the industrial output of Buffalo had reached its peak and was starting to decline. Buffalo became a huge transportation hub, starting with the Erie Canal in the mid 1800s, and then with the addition of the railroads to supplement and then surpass the Erie Canal. It really grew into a hub for shipping and railroading and all kinds of transport logistics, as well as very heavy industry, steel manufacturing, automobile production over the years, all different kinds of very heavy industry, primarily located south and north of the town. The Niagara River, which you can see in the right photo, is pretty much unnavigable to commercial ships, at least since the removal of the Erie Canal. But there's definitely been chemical industries and other things located upriver from Buffalo into the Tonawandas and Niagara Falls area. But that's the genesis for trying to revitalize downtown Buffalo starting in the 50s. And there were initial discussions or proposals for a system in the early 60s and early 70s that was related to, how do we transform the city or try and address the population, what was perceived as population loss, to keep downtown Buffalo vibrant and active. And one of the proposals was a rapid transit system. On the left here, you're looking down Main Street actually at the time, and you can kind of see what a lot of people in Buffalo still think was like the historic hustle and bustle.
Sorry. So sorry, we can't see your screen. So sorry, Rich.
Oh, thanks, Alan. I appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate you hopping in there. I did not hit share screen. Well, that was.
Here we go.
There we go. So appreciate you jumping in there, Alan. Thanks so much. So this was the picture that I was talking about at first. So we're looking. This is the picture that we are looking southbound on Main Street with the train coming northbound. I apologize for that. And now we're into these historic looks of downtown Buffalo in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And like I was mentioning, the photo on the left here is kind of that bustling era that a lot of people think was still vibrant and vital in the area around the time that the rapid transit system was being discussed. And on the right, you'll see an aerial shot of kind of downtown Buffalo looking west towards the Niagara River in Fort Erie, Ontario, on this other side of the river, with Niagara Falls kind of off to the right. So as you see already at this stage, there's just a wealth of surface parking lots in downtown that was really signaling what was going to happen in downtown over the years. Is automobile use became the primary focus of mobility in Western New York, and gradually the density, although a lot of that still was in place in terms of taller buildings along Main Street, really was peeled off over time in favor of making the car more accessible and convenient. And this doesn't even show much of the highway installations that have happened since then, that kind of further separated downtown from its neighborhoods. I talked about the heavy industry, and here we're looking at Bethlehem Steel in Lackawanna and Blaisdell, and you can kind of just see the mammoth footprint of what we were talking about. And there were other steel firms and manufacturers in that area. We're looking north, basically north and west with downtown Buffalo in the distance here, and you can see the plethora of rail lines serving in here, and this whole area generally lost its vitality as Bethlehem Steel certainly is the largest, but other manufacturers were leaving the area in the 60s and 70s. So before we get into what the plans for Metro Rail were like, I want to kind of talk about this great myth that that kind of underlies a lot of the thinking, is that both in Western New York and around the nation and beyond there, that everybody just left Buffalo and half the population was gone from the area. And while the actual population in the city limits of Buffalo certainly took a nosedive and is more than half or less than half what it was in the 50s, you can see the extent of sprawl since the 1950s. And that if you look in the legend on the left-hand side there, the metro population is essentially unchanged over the past half century and longer. The most recent census actually showed a slight uptick in population in the Buffalo city limits. So while a lot of people did leave, and you can count me as one of those, who went to college in Washington, a lot of people went to that area, Charlotte and Florida and Arizona and all over the country. Enough people were either maintained or moved in, but they moved elsewhere outside of the core historic urbanized areas in the region. You can see the extent stretching out throughout Erie County and Niagara County in the red there. So while it's true that the city of Buffalo lost its population, there was still, a sizable urban area that could potentially support high quality, high frequency mass transit service if the right route was picked. So in addition to kind of that downtown revitalization energy that was going on around that time, there was also the decision to locate the main campus of the State University of New York at Buffalo. Common misunderstanding, it's not of Buffalo, the University of Buffalo, it's the University at Buffalo. To locate that out in suburban Amherst, even beyond the streetcar suburbs that were in the town of Amherst, like Eggertsville and Snyder. This was undeveloped land and kind of in the center of the town. And that's the rendering you see here on the bottom right side of what could that new campus in Amherst look like if it had high capacity rail transit linking it down to downtown Buffalo and the neighborhoods in between. And you'll see on most of these renderings, what you're looking at is a Great Society era subway type system that looks a lot like maybe the Washington Metro or MARTA in Atlanta or BART, kind of the design of the vehicles. This was, their initial thinking was a heavy rail, rapid transit system that would be totally grade separated. And if you see this really funky proposal on the right-hand side of a fully enclosed Main Street plaza with an atrium extending multiple blocks, you can actually see that bank tower in the background there, with the subway running right down the middle underneath. So that was the original vision for what they were trying to achieve: high platform stations with a lot of subway tunnels and other separation involved to link the UB campus to downtown Buffalo. So I always, when I see these images, I'm kind of really amazed and awestruck at what they thought they might be able to get in a place like Buffalo. But there was still a lot of the identity up there, thinking that this was historically at once one of the top 10 largest cities in the country around the turn of the century, and how can we get that back? And that those visions of grandeur certainly informed a lot of the thinking of what the initial designers were sketching out here. And before I go any further, I want to include a shout out to kind of someone who taught me a lot about not only the system in Buffalo, but systems around the country, the late Gordon Thompson, who worked at the NFTA and was on the Citizens Regional Transit Committee for a long time. Got to spend a good amount of time with him and really accessed a lot of his knowledge and thinking. So I want to say kudos to Gordon for mentoring a young teenage rail fan when he was still around. So how did the designs for the system transform from that vision to what became the route of Metro Rail? You can kind of see some sketches here, and I want to kind of undercut this all with, as I mentioned earlier, because of the industrial foundations and the Erie Canal, Buffalo had a huge legacy railroad network, certainly with the New York Central having multiple routes in the region. But anybody essentially doing business as a railroad on the East Coast or the Midwest ran lines into Buffalo. You're talking the Pennsylvania, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Lehigh Valley, Delaware, Lackawanna and Western, the Erie, Nickel Plate, Canadian railroads. All those came together in Buffalo and really had the second most rail activity in the 20th century after Chicago, or at least most of the 20th century. And you don't even see most of the lines on these renderings here, but especially east and south of the city, they're extensive right of ways available. So they took a look at where's the highest density in the region, and basically the Main Street corridor came to the front as the preferred way to connect downtown with the University of Buffalo campus. And historically, Main Street was the most heavily used streetcar line and then bus line. And the regional streetcar operator at the time, the International Railway Corp, actually ran standard streetcars interurbans all the way out Main Street to where the current LaSalle station is, and then ran them up that diagonal line that you see listed as the Tonawandis corridor all the way to Niagara Falls, and did it in under an hour while going down Main Street. So just historically, Main Street, that southeast, the southwest to northwest running corridor, at least to the current South Campus area, was the #1 corridor throughout Buffalo's history in terms of transit service. So they basically sketched out that line. You see a pretty pronounced jog off to the east from what the system is today, serving what's now known as ECC or ECMC. What's listed here is Meyer Hospital, and then scooting back over to South Campus. That was to access this former International Railway Corps line, as well as the Erie Railroad's Niagara Falls branch, which runs diagonally from Niagara Falls down to the east side of Buffalo. So that was the impetus. Even before they sketched out the final system, they were thinking of connecting and expanding it long-term, certainly over that Tonawanda's route long-term. And here, and something you don't hear much talked about these days, is this curvy line through the west side connecting to Black Rock and Tonawanda, kind of running a north-south route, basically down Richmond and Elmwood on the west side, then looping through downtown and then running out through the New York Central main corridor to the east side and Cheektowaga. The east side part of that is still discussed, but the west side line almost never gets any play any longer, is something that people talk about. So that's the planning focus that folks like Gordon Thompson and others were sketching out in the late 70s and early 80s. Just going to omit a couple of folks here. And to folks joining, thanks for hopping on with us today. Just got about a quarter of the way through, but we are recording this session, so you should be able to catch up later on, but thanks for being with us this evening. So here we go to about 1984, when they opened the system and put it all together. You can see on the right, there is Barbara Bush. At the time, the second lady, George Bush, was the vice president at the time, and they brought her up to kick off the line. She's wearing an NFTA engineer style cap there, as you can see. But it was actually May 10th, 1985, but they were pretty much finished with testing and building in 1984, or finished with construction in 1984. And you can see the opening celebration here on Main Street in 1985. And that's when my dad here, Dave, took me out and rode the system on opening day. And it was jam-packed that day. So what are some of the elements of that kind of went along with the opening of the system? And these are a couple of my favorite graphics that I have in my collection of those early days. And at one time I actually had this image on the left as a brochure that I kept in my collection for a while, with that great 1970s, earth tones color scheme. And this is what they were pitching when the system opened. You can see on the right-hand side the operation of the system with that same color scheme on the vehicles running northbound on Main Street here, with the iconic gold dome bank on the right-hand side. A lot of this has changed since then, in some in good ways, and a lot not so great. But you see that distinctive green paint there on the side. This is intended to be a pedestrian mall to accompany the Metro Rail, and it wasn't only intended; it actually was executed like that. And the goal was to get people to take the train or get downtown by bus or car, and use the extensive sidewalks, the wide sidewalks, to go up and down Main Street to support businesses that they were trying to revitalize or maintain at the time. But what Buffalo ended up getting here was a 6.4 mile rapid transit system. First 1.2 miles was above ground, and the second 5.2 miles was below ground. And I think this is a really interesting map, and I'll diagram here, and I'll show you a bigger format one on the next slide, is showing how the different phases of the system were built. And I pitched this session as answering that question of why did they build it backwards, and in a lot of people's consideration. And I'll just spend a few minutes on that. First of all, you can see that, interestingly, the initial subway section outside of downtown is actually at a higher elevation the topography is actually higher than it was downtown, or at least has been made that way in downtown over the years. So um, there were several factors that played in. And if you see around the Delvin College station, or at least what was called Delvin College back then, a liberal arts college, Canisius College, a Jesuit-run Catholic college, is located about halfway through the line. And they weren't necessarily opposed to rapid transit service going by their campus, but they didn't want it above ground, and particularly the overhead wires. Perhaps, just what they thought would be disrupting the vistas of Delaware Park across the street from their campus, or whatever was their arguments about that. That was, from what I've heard and collected over the decades now, that the opposition of Delaware, or of Canisius College, and perhaps some neighborhood residents nearby, was one of the main factors in deciding to put it underground there. And then another element was down near the auditorium station. If they were going to dig in tunnel underground, they would have to go underneath the New York Central's Niagara branch, which is actually below grade right around there. So it would have required a lot of, or a deeper cut to get underneath that railroad line. At the time, and what actually happened was they ended up using the former DL&W train shed as the yards and shops. And so it required a very steep ascent out of that tunnel to use those yards and shops. From what I've heard, those were the two main factors of building it, and what some people call backwards or upside down. An interesting factor, and I'll get to how this plays out in ridership in a couple minutes, but by building most of the system underground and not running at surface level, it actually probably increased or decreased the travel time, increased the speed that the trains could run through the subway section versus above ground. So that could be a big factor over time in attracting people to use the system based on its overall lower trip time than traveling on the surface. So those are kind of some of the factors that went into that decision, but really interesting bit of topography here going on. Here's another schematic of that era, and I like those autumn tones again showing up everywhere, including the moon there on this graphic. It's great, but you can kind of see how those initial stations were laid out and where their different depths and orientations were on this grid. Since then, several stations have changed names, and one has been removed, the theater station, which is only a block from what was then called Huron, now Fountain Plaza, was removed during the Cars on Main Street project, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But Allen Hospital is now called Allen Medical Campus. Delvin College is now Delvin Canisius College. South Campus is now University. Auditorium is now Erie Canal Harbor. So there's been a lot of the stations have been renamed and kind of reoriented in terms of what they're trying to describe as their footprint since then. A little bit about the vehicles that Metro Rail uses. Currently, there's 27, but originally there was 29 vehicles manufactured by the Tokyo Car Corp in Japan. A lot of transit observers know these were based on the same shell that Tokyo was building for the US standard light rail vehicle, most of which ended up being kind of finalized by Boeing. And you'd see them in San Francisco and Boston. I think a few are still maybe running in Boston to this day. And I believe also Pittsburgh ended up using this format. So that same front, that cab look that you see here on the Metro cars is pretty common in the early North American rail systems, especially those that weren't being built by Siemens at the time. So what's different compared to all those other ones that I just mentioned is these vehicles are non-articulated, as in they're single rail cars. You can't even move between them, or an operator can't even move between them, because each car has cabs at both ends. Conceivably, and this has happened a few times in bad weather where they could operate single rail cars on their own, is kind of a very long streetcar. But the other benefit is each car has lots of capacity versus each half of an articulated car. So that's the main difference. NFTA can run up to 4-car trains, which they do kind of during special events, namely Sabres games or big events downtown, like Taste of Buffalo and things like that. The platforms, both above ground and below ground, can accommodate up to 4 cars at a time. Generally, they run 2. Sometimes you'll see 3, and then 4 cars consists in the for special events. 3 doors on each side, which are staggered so that they don't line up with each other, and that's for when they serve different stations on different sides. But one of the other interesting elements is the fold up stairs, so that they can serve the entirely high level platforms underground, and then just one high level boarding platform for those who need an accessible entrance above ground stations. Everybody else walks upstairs, which then fold up underneath the car. San Francisco has a variation of this, both in their original Boeing cars as well as their new ones that they're running from Siemens these days. They can run up to 50 miles an hour underground, a little much slower above ground. So that's kind of the nuances of the rail cars themselves. I'll just go through some of the stations here. And I realize that I'm already kind of at almost a half hour, so it'll be just a little bit longer than promised 30 minutes, but I don't think y'all will mind all that much. The stations out towards the further end, the north end of the system, are in what's called tube format, or kind of a circular format, with twin tubes on each side of the island platforms in these stations. And these now kind of have a common element of the brownish tiles with the blue warning strip, the rumble strip, for accessibility concerns. And they've added these yellow pylons to segregate between the gaps between the station, or between the rail cars and the stations. So that's University, LaSalle, Humboldt Hospital, and Delvin Canisius College that you can see here. Kind of standing on its own is Amherst Street, which is one of my favorites. It's an island platform, but an open vault format where not the tube design, and on the sides are is artwork of the neighborhood housing in the area. And the North Buffalo part of town takes a lot of pride in its housing stock, particularly the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Martin House that's only a couple blocks away. That's the field that Amherst Station is trying to capture here with the artwork of the houses on the sides, but a little more open air format than you see in the tube stations. Utica and Summer Best are very similar in kind of how they're laid out, along with basically Allen Medical Campus, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's that much more box-like shape that you see in Montreal and other places on a lot of stations, with the tracks in the middle and the platforms on the sides, with a mezzanine bridge to transfer between tracks and up to the surface. So you can kind of get the sense, other than the artwork in each station, these two stations are very similar. And these two, along with Allen Medical Campus, were built with cut and cover method, as in they dug a hole in the street, they built the stations and the tracks, and then they covered it back up to surface level. Whereas the rock tunnel was dug deeper and through different methods. I want to talk about Allen Medical Campus briefly. This station is most accurately described as the system's only transit-oriented development type station that currently exists. There's of course businesses and some development that's gone on by other stations, but this station has been totally reformatted to fit into the medical campus, the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus that's surrounding there. And you can kind of see the brand new surface level entrance in buildings right above the station. That's not something that you see anywhere else in the subway stations on the Buffalo system. And for my dad, you can see his grandsons walking into the station in that bottom photo there when we were visiting a couple years ago. So the station photo on the right is one I took a couple years ago, and the station looks like so many others around the country, with that the tile and the brown brick walls, brown tile walls. We've counted on Twitter about 12 or 14 stations around the country, around the world, that look just like the Allen Medical Campus station. And I'll I'll share that thread on that once I post this all on Twitter. Some station entrances are, you can definitely see that brutalism in some cases, or certainly industrial look that was common in the late 70s, early 80s when the system was being planned out. Lots of square boxy concrete, but some natural light getting down into the stations. And artwork was and is common. Artwork installations and sculpture and inside the stations throughout the subway portions. All stations had at least one bus route serving it, and several, like University Station, which has a large bus loop right in front of the main entrance area, had several. So these are all opportunities in the future for the NFTA to build up, maybe replacing some of these head houses with taller structures above them. The only two stations that have parking lots are University and LaSalle at the far end of the system. Everything else is designed for foot traffic or bus riders. Above ground, all the stations above ground were replaced as part of the Carzo Main Street project, which I'll get to. And previously, they kind of had the same format of a gray metal or green metal that was featured some wind protection with glass or plexiglass, and a general format that was the same across all the above ground systems or stations. You can see the top one here at Seneca Street, and then the bottom at Lafayette Square, what those stations used to look like. And neither of these, you can see the boarding area that's raised to high level that the front of the train would meet up with. But in the bottom picture, it's just off to the left-hand side of that photo. Little different look these days with much more glass and metal. Overall smaller structures, but here you can see the high level boarding plaza now, or boarding location at Fountain Plaza. And then the Lafayette Square station is become sponsored by Evans Bank and painted in a bright orange to reflect their corporate brand. So the above ground stations are much different than they were, and in different states of completion since they have been doing the project. I mentioned the D&W terminal shops when we got into the above ground, below ground decision. You can see what's left of the former DL&W terminal here, which was on the lower level, which is freight depot before, and on the above ground level was the station platforms. That all remains and was turned into the shop area on the lower level for Metro Rail. In the bottom left postcard there was what the head house used to look like for the building, which was a grand facility and hosted not only DL&W, but nickel plate as well. Back in the day, you could actually board a ship right outside of those side doors there on the Buffalo River. There is some effort right now to extend the line briefly to add a station on the side of the shops area to connect to a revitalized upstairs area that's currently underway. So that's a possible improvement of the system. The congressman of the area, Brian Higgins, who's on the transportation committee in the House, is very supportive of this project. And you can see a bit of the cobblestone area that's emerged around the Sabres Arena, which is right behind the terminal, or what's left of the terminal there. So this is the Buffalo River, which in that photo you can see lots of ice. Behind that is a skyway, and then beyond that is Lake Erie and the Niagara River. I've mentioned the Carzo Main Street project a few times. I want to talk about what was going on there and the impact on the rail operations. This is looking at basically where the former theater station used to be, right in front of the Shays Buffalo Theater, which is very much still active as a touring Broadway show house these days. The ridership on Metro Rail has always been very strong, and I'll get to that more in a second, but there was a sense that the pedestrian law format of the project didn't line up with what the businesses in the area wanted to do. And so over decades, there was an effort to reopen Main Street, or at least the portion that Metro Rail runs on, to cars. So that begun in the mid 2000s, kind of block by block, and nearly all of the segments that have been approved have been completed now, with just one lane of parking on the right-hand side, a bike lane in between, and then cars being allowed to travel on the Metro Rail bed area to get in and out of those parking spots. But it's definitely intended as a through street when traveling on the rail tracks. Having not lived up there recently, I can't say with complete accuracy that there isn't major incidents regularly, but the times I've ridden it, there doesn't seem to be major issues with cars impeding Metro Rail movements. You can see on the back of the trains now, or on the front and back of the trains, depending on which side you're looking, there's a caution: do not get close to the vehicles while trains are moving. But the way that the traffic signal system is set up really prevents a lot of car movement while trains are moving. More details on cars on Main Street. You can kind of see the final project on the right-hand side here. This is a train coming out of the subway portal, and they installed a standard railroad crossing gate here to protect trains and, I guess, auto drivers from driving into trains while it's coming out of the portal. There's a similar gate on the other side of the tracks for trains kind of exiting the Main Street corridor there. At the same time as they were working on this, they totally rebuilt the rail bed of the system as part of the project. So that was at least an enhancement of the infrastructure. The challenge is the last few years of ridership data, while Metro was operating in some case totally closed off service and other times single track service, the ridership reflected that for several years, almost right up until the COVID era, in terms of them not running their full 8-minute scheduled service at all times of the day, or even all day during peak periods due to the project. So that's going to be an interesting impact over the next decade as COVID hopefully recedes a little bit into travel patterns, if that ridership will return to where it was. I will say that while there's definitely a commuter segment going to office jobs downtown, that's not even the majority of the riders on the system. A lot of the folks who work downtown live out in suburbs where they can't access Metro Rail. So it's folks using the system as all-day transit service for a variety of reasons, including low-income workers getting to work at different times, students, people accessing all kinds of services. So it's hardly a commuter-only oriented operation, and that the standard schedule reflects that, with about 8-minute frequency on weekdays. I want to talk about ridership here just briefly, and this is from Christoph Spieler's book, his North American Transit Atlas, and this is the light rail ridership section. And you can see that while it kind of looks like that Buffalo's middle of the pack here, it beats out nearly all of the light rail systems built since there, mostly because it's such a small system, and they built it in the highest density corridor in the area, and they run really fast, very frequent service on a limited route. So per mile trips, Buffalo is always among the highest in the nation, even though it has such a small system. It's a lesson for other systems or communities that looking at light rail and kind of light metro systems even, in how you can format a system, picking the best route with the best transit usage and going from there. Just some shots of kind of the activity level on Metro Rail. I think these are all pre-COVID era photos, but you can see this is the University Station with the train unloading. A lot of these folks are heading to all the bus routes that are served at the University Station. I'm going to move into the expansion segment of the presentation here, starting by talk about the Tonawanda turnout. And I've spoken about the Tonawanda corridor earlier in the presentation. They originally planning on cutting the line over to meet up with this former Erie and International Railway corridor through the Tonawandas up towards Niagara Falls. As part of that, they built a cutout of the line, tunnels on each side in between the Amherst and LaSalle stations, to allow trains to directly continue out towards that Tonawanda corridor without cutting into the tunnels later on. Those, although they're unused and don't have tracks in place, are still in place and could be activated. And you can kind of see this. This is that corridor on the left-hand side I was mentioning as it heads from northwest to southeast. Plenty of space, although there's been some encroachment of residential development on the right of way recently. But that's, as you see that very grainy picture of that stadium there behind Bennett High School, that is where the turnout tunnel kind of points towards, allowing trains to hop around to the Tonawandis line. Early on, or not early on, but in the early to mid 90s, the NFTA explored not having trains run all the way through on the Tonawandis line, but stopping them and running a shuttle from the LaSalle station up to to the city of Tonawanda. They actually purchased a handful of PCC cars from Cleveland. And these are those cars, once they ended up at the NFTA, they put their logo on the side, but didn't change the colors. They put pantograph poles on them instead of the old trolley poles. They tested one out on the line, but it was too wide to get past the auditorium station's high platform. And that's about as far as that went. They didn't end up building any infrastructure on the Tonawandis line. And these were eventually sold off to a nonprofit in Brooklyn who was trying to establish a historic trolley operation there. They never ended up being used there, and they were scrapped and sold off eventually, which is kind of a shame, but they were in pretty poor condition by the time they left the NFTA there. So now for the full-on expansion talk here. Since the beginning, there's been a vision to, or at least ideas to expand it in different directions using the really high capacity subway investment that they made as a trunk line, reaching out towards the Tonawandas, which I've talked a lot about, and originally completing the line. The line was intended to be completed up to the University of Buffalo. The decision to build so much of it in subway led it to be truncated at the current University South Campus station. I'll talk a little bit more about that project later on, but there's visions for a route towards the airport and various retail areas in Cheektowaga on the east side that would also pass the historic, but currently not always used Central Terminal, New York Central Terminal on the east side, as well as a pair of lines heading down to the South Towns and Orchard Park and Hamburg. Nearly all of these, except the Amherst line, would use former and mostly abandoned rail corridors, although the line to Hamburg is still pretty much operational. You can see these maps are produced by the Citizens for Regional Transit Corp. I was a member at one time of that organization, and they keep the flame alive for extending the Metro Rail system. They also have a couple ideas for some very short historic streetcar trolley operations in various sectors that are kind of conceptual, not very likely to emerge anytime soon. But you can see on their second map, they also have a vision for using the former Lehigh Valley Niagara Falls line through Williamsville and Amherst to reach Niagara Falls, as well as running service on the Beltline. And the Beltline is a former New York Central loop around what was then the urbanized area. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on that because I could do a whole other session on the Beltline and what it would take to run service there. I'm going to move on to the Amherst extension. For a while, this was just as dormant as any of the other extensions to Tonawanda or Cheektowaga or anywhere else. In the last 5 years, there's been a focus from the NFTA, which was previously basically not committal or not interested in expanding the system anytime soon. But there was also a lot of resistance from the town of Amherst and essentially no interest from the University of Buffalo to reach the North Campus. All three of those entities have flipped their perspective on extending the line or completing the line, depending on how you phrase it, out to the University of Buffalo campus. And what you see here on the right is the map, the current proposed map, if they end up choosing light rail as the mode to run this corridor. What's different about previous plans is they've shifted the route to instead run on the Niagara Falls Boulevard up to Maple Road, and then head east and then northeast up to the University of Buffalo campus. Before, there was a combination of using Bailey Avenue and Millersport and different options for getting up to UB, but this is the current plan, including kind of a left hook away from the current university station underneath Kenmore and then Niagara Falls Boulevard in subway, and then it would emerge right where that yellow part of the line stops, right around Princeton Avenue in Niagara Falls Boulevard. There would be a general rethinking of Niagara Falls Boulevard as a kind of a fast, 4-6 lane arterial road to a much more traffic road diet type structure if Metro Rail ends up going in the middle of that route. But it would be fully grade separated. We're not talking about shared lanes here. It would be fully grade separated in the middle of the road up to Maple with a couple of stops. The other difference here is it serves the eastern neighborhoods in the town of Tonawanda, whereas previous versions just were serving Amherst. And that has opened up a little more support for the project. The rendering on the left side is would be at the University of Buffalo North Campus, the Flint station. And UB actually has planned all new residential, on-campus residential and retail development that would correspond with the couple stations right in the middle of campus, as well as one serving their the dormitory complex that they have there. So very interesting vision here. This is, sorry about the quality of the image here, but this would be at Niagara Falls Boulevard and Maple Road. You can see in the back part of the rendering, the former Boulevard Mall, or what's still the Boulevard Mall, but there's also plans to potentially run this route diagonally through that property and get off Niagara Falls Boulevard even a little sooner. Just with upzoning the multifamily and residential properties right along Niagara Falls Boulevard, this would be a huge change in land usage from what's there, which is a lot of auto-oriented retail and food places alongside Niagara Falls Boulevard currently. I want to talk a little bit about kind of how I see some of these extensions, and that while I think that running Metro Rail on both Tonawanda's corridor and up to Amherst is the smart way to use that infrastructure, switching to a regional rail format, allowing at least initially service from Niagara Falls to downtown Buffalo on the Niagara Falls, on the Niagara branch, currently CSX, formerly New York Central, and then running different branches out from there to perhaps as far as Erie, or maybe Salamanca or Olean on kind of the south side, and Jamestown along there, as well as running out to Rochester. What this would, well, it might make sense to keep one mode and keep building that road, that mode. Utilizing the existing railroads where they're operational would prevent the need to either take those away from the existing, freight operations, or build a new Metro Rail trackage alongside those. You can run almost the same frequency with the new DMU and perhaps EMU vehicles that are out there, and still achieve the same level of service with connection right around the auditorium area and the Amtrak station. So the left-hand image there is actually a crayon sketch that I literally drew out by crayon a few years ago, kind of envisioning the different lines. And on the right side is the different railway infrastructure in the area. And you can see it's very extensive, with CSX and Norfolk Southern doing the bulk of the work, but both Canadian railroads end up here along with some local operators. So there's a lot of currently in service rail along with the historic right-of-way corridors. So it's Buffalo, and I managed to get through this whole thing without showing any trains in snow. So here we are, wrapping up with a look down Main Street right around the former theater station, with the train heading outbound north on Main Street heading towards the subway. So that's kind of what I have for you this evening. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen sharing and open it up to any questions or dialogue thoughts. I want to thank everybody who tuned in here tonight. Plan on doing a few more of these on different topics, but thanks for tuning in. I'll be sharing this, the recording of this on RAILMag Twitter before too long. But any questions or thoughts or anything you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I have
Go ahead.
Hi, it's Bart Reed from the Transit Coalition. How are you guys doing today?
How you doing, Bart?
I just wanted to mention the National Infrastructure Bank and some of the things you described here. I'm not sure of the entity in terms of expanding transit in this particular area. I'm working on transit expansions in Los Angeles. The Expo line has been open now for a couple of years, very successful, and we're working on a line between the San Fernando Valley and West Los Angeles. And I years ahead, extension of the Crenshaw line to West Hollywood. So the National Infrastructure Bank is a bank. If there's an entity like the Niagara Frontier Transit or whatever the correct name is, wants to get a loan to finance the expansion, that's the whole point of the National Infrastructure Bank. And we're also on Twitter, and the whole idea is the infrastructure bank can finance things such as rail extensions, water renewal, internet, and all sorts of missing infrastructure around the country. So I just wanted to mention that. And Rich, you might want to check into the National Infrastructure Bank. If you in email with Bart Reed at 1851 email, I'll be happy to send out the invitation, because we're having a meeting, I think, on Thursday.
And Bart, how does that relate to all the funding from the new infrastructure bill that will likely be channeled through New Starts and the existing transit programs? How do those two things relate?
It's a fabulous question. A lot of transit properties and entities don't either qualify or have the ability to get the grants, and the funding bill sounds great, but there's not a lot of capacity in it. So have a smaller entity like Buffalo's Transit, and they have some sales avenue that they can pay back, qualify for a loan. This is a bank. This is not a grant. So those grants for certain areas of the country that need grants because they don't have money to pay for, like getting rid of lead pipes. But the whole point is that it adds trillions of dollars of capacity, and it's bank loans. The National Infrastructure Bank was used to build the the highway system that Eisenhower built. That's where a lot of the money came from. It was used to build the dams, the waterways in the 30s. It's been used 4 different times, and this is currently going through Congress right now. So it's completely add-on to what we have from the government now. The government pretty much is tapped out, and this is a complete new source of funds, and there's money to take and get the money to fund it. And the different entities, which generally are public entities like transit authorities and water authorities and whatnot, they can pay back low interest rate loans at a very low interest. And that's why this is something to look into. So I think it's very beneficial from our world of transit.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Bart. I'll follow up on getting some more resources out to our audience on what that program's about. I think one of the challenges that, the NFTA has and the local leaders is, not so much only the funding to get the infrastructure and capital resources in place to extend the system, but the ongoing operating costs, which are generally not federally supported at all. And anytime that these expansions comes up, that the ongoing operations funding is as much of a factor as the cost to build it. So I just wanted to build on that point there, Bart. Other thoughts, feel free to.
I completely understand the point. We have in California, we have local counties that are funded. Some places like Ventura County aren't funded, so we can't expand Metrolink in Ventura County. But it's the same issue around the country. But in some cases, infrastructure improvement is an issue. So.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But I do realize the funding problem to operate systems. Thank you.
If anyone has any thoughts or questions, go ahead and raise your hand using the reactions button there, and I'll call on folks so we don't end up talking all over. But other thoughts? Well, I'm going to turn it over to my dad, Dave. What's your thought there, Dad?
Thanks for the presentation, Rich. I just thought I'd add a little local flavor from our experience with Metro Rail, mentioning that the $1.2 mile section of Metro Rail is fare free. It was since its inception and still remains so today, although the Metro Rail has been considering installing fees on the surface section. And for the first 10 years or so of Metro Rail, I participated in an event that really kind of illustrated Metro Rail's willingness to cooperate with the community. I participated in the Taste of Buffalo, the second largest food festival in the nation, for a 2-day weekend in July. And we would have over 50 restaurants along the surface section of the Metro Rail from Fountain Plaza to 1M&T Plaza. And restaurants would set up, and we would tap into the catenary wires for electrical service to the restaurants so they could make their chicken wings and all the other fare. But also, just as a small tidbit, working that event, we used the transit stops as our ticket booths. And the Fountain Plaza to the 1M&T Plaza was a linear mile. And over the course of a 2-day event, I walked it 72 times. And then just a little, I'm going to put Rich on the spot here. When you saw that crayon drawing of the extensions, I just want to let you know that we have newspaper print on the walls in our room down in our basement where Richard was drawing extensions, proposed extensions, when he was in middle school. And with that, I'll lower my hand.
Thanks very much, Ed. Other thoughts, questions out there?
Yeah, I had a couple. I do some projects with UB School of Architecture and Planning from time to time. And I was involved with a study in 2012, 2013 of decking the Kensington, a project that looks like it's going to be moving forward with some state and federal help. One of the things that was studied by the architecture and planning professors and students during that study was the potential for using the 33 as the route to the airport, rather than using the sort of remote old West Shore Railroad right of way that's currently the leading contender for extending Metro Rail to the airport. I'm wondering what kind of design considerations or funding implications there are for reusing, for sharing a highway with a rail service. And if there's other cities that have incorporated that successfully, and what it looks like. And also, I was so intrigued to see on a couple of your diagrams a proposed loop for Allentown, and also a proposed loop for Parkside, because I'm currently doing some planning work regarding the Scajaquada corridor and some other urban planning, and I've actually proposed both of those things, and I didn't realize anyone else actually had. So maybe there's some actual proposals out there for those things that I could tap into.
Thanks, Alan. And Alan is one of the few folks in the Twitter universe that I met in person. He's at Hey Ra Cha Cha on Twitter if you want to give him a follow. But yeah, Alan, I'll go with the first question on the 33 and Humboldt Expressway first. Is I think a lot of folks on here would know there's a lot of discussion or maybe criticism sometimes on using highway medians for transit corridors in terms of the land use around them being not so hot. Now, I know I don't need to tell you that the goal of kind of reclaiming the 33 here, the Kensington Expressway, is to restore, address some of those long-standing kind of impacts that the highway had on the east side communities. So in terms of using a existing freeway and de-escalating it from high capacity, a neighborhood killing type of format, that certainly hasn't been done. Although I think there was some element of the Baltimore Red Line project that might have used a former highway, easement or something like that. I can't go very deep on that, off the top of my head, but I think that's one example. But if you look at, highway median rail lines, they just don't have very good supportive land use, which impacts their ability to draw additional riders. But those of you know me on RAILMag, I'm a very pragmatic type of person, and generally I want to see some level of service than no service. But I understand the debate here on the highway median issue, so it's a good one. And then on the second point, I think CRTC or CRT now was the one who have floated these kind of these neighborhood circulator. There probably would be streetcar formats, and we know some of the challenges with those in terms of not having dedicated lanes. But I think the interest level is located there at CRT on those things. Other thoughts or questions that you want to ask about Buffalo Metro Rail, or ask me as RAILMag while you see me live and in person, not just that square R on Twitter? Well, after I post this, I'll do a YouTube recording of it and post it out there. Feel free to comment and discuss anything that really captured your interest in terms of the past or the expansion programs, plans, and we can talk a little bit about more of those going forward. I might not be able to do one of these in February. We have our big conference for SWATA in Austin. If you want to check any details on that, swata.org. But hopefully in March, I'll look at doing one on commuter versus regional rail. Last year, I was out in Utah riding the Front Runner, which is just an excellent example for a relatively high frequency regional rail that runs 2 ways all days and just has some great operational elements besides its lack of electrification. We'll talk about Denver being a good model, which is electrified and pretty much, along with Philadelphia, the only things close to international standards for regional rail. So I know I'm hardly the only one talking about this topic. And if you're tuning into TransitCon on Sunday, I know folks like Sandy Johnston and other people you probably know on Twitter will be talking about regional rail. But I'll do another one of these next, and then Lackawanna Cutoff will be my third installment. We'll see how much energy I have to do more beyond that. But thanks again for you all tuning in today. Appreciate it. Hope to meet some of you in person, and hope you have a good week and keep engaging on rail and transit topics. I love talking to y'all. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.